What happens when a brand new police chief walks into his own precinct undercover and gets spit in the face by an officer who thinks he's just a nobody? What unfolds next will shatter the entire department and leave you stunned until the very last moment. Stay with me, because this story isn't just about one man. It's about what happens when truth finally rips the mask off a broken system. It was a muggy Tuesday morning in August when Richard Nelson, the newly appointed police chief of Blue Ridge, stepped out of his car. The small city lay nestled in the rolling hills of North Carolina, its precinct scarred by rumors of misconduct and whispers of corruption. Richard had spent 20 years in law enforcement, but today he dressed not as a chief, not as a man of rank, but as a stranger. Faded plaid shirt, scuffed sneakers, jeans worn at the knees. He wanted no red carpet welcomes, no stiff salutes, no rehearsed speeches. He wanted to see his officers without masks, to glimpse the culture when no one knew they were being watched. And so he walked across the buzzing parking lot. Officers laughing, trading weekend stories, barely giving him a glance. To them, he was invisible, just another nobody drifting too close to a place he didn't belong. Inside, the fluorescent lights glared cold against the tiled floors, the smell of stale coffee clinging to the air. Phones rang, keyboards clicked, chatter filled every corner. Richard moved slow, observing. Groups huddled at desks. Jokes cracked in the break room. Laughter carried down the halls. For a moment, he thought perhaps this undercover plan might reveal subtle truths. But what happened next was anything but subtle. Because just minutes later, one officer would step forward, and in one vile act, expose the rot Richard had come to confront. Richard paused near the break room. A voice snapped across the noise like a whip. "Hey you lost or something?" He turned to see a broad-shouldered white officer striding toward him, a smug grin carved into his face. His badge read Officer Daniels. Behind him, a cluster of cops leaned against the wall, watching like spectators at a cruel show. "This isn't a shelter," Daniels sneered. "You don't belong here." Richard's chest tightened. He opened his mouth to answer, but Daniels cut him off, voice louder, meaner, designed for his audience. "Didn't you hear me? Get out. We don't need people like you hanging around." The others laughed, the sound bouncing sharp against the walls. Richard clenched his jaw. He had faced worse, but what came next pierced deeper than words. Daniels stepped closer. His grin widened, and with deliberate cruelty he spit straight into Richard's face. The room erupted. Officers slapped desks, howled with laughter, muttered about showing riffraff their place. The warm saliva slid down Richard's cheek as the laughter pounded in his ears. He didn't shout. He didn't strike back. Slowly, with unshakable calm, Richard reached for his handkerchief, wiped his face clean, and asked one quiet, devastating question. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" But Daniels only smirked. "Only the ones who don't belong." In that moment, Daniels thought he had humiliated a powerless stranger. What he didn't know was that his entire world was about to collapse, in front of everyone. Moments later, the intercom crackled. "All personnel, report to the briefing room." The room filled with officers, laughter still echoing from the break room. Daniels leaned smugly against the wall, satisfied with his morning entertainment. Richard slipped through a side door, this time carrying a leather folder marked with the precinct's seal. He stood quietly, waiting. At the front, Captain Harris cleared his throat. "All right, settle down. Today we introduce our new chief of police. A man with 2 decades of service. A proven leader." Whispers spread. Eyes turned toward the door. And then Richard stepped forward. His presence changed the air itself. Calm, unyielding, commanding. He placed the folder on the lectern and scanned the room, locking eyes with every single officer, until his gaze landed on Daniels. The color drained from the man's face. His smirk collapsed. The silence was suffocating. Richard's voice broke it. Strong, steady, unflinching. "Good morning. My name is Richard Nelson. As of today, I am your new chief of police." Gasps rippled through the room. Daniel's jaw went slack. Officers who had laughed now stared in stunned horror. And what Richard said next would not only strip the smirk off Daniel's face, it would ignite a firestorm that would forever change the precinct. Richard began slowly, his voice firm but measured. This morning, I walked into this building in plain clothes. I wanted to see the truth, not the polished image presented at inspections. He let the silence grow. Officers shifted in their seats, uneasy. What I witnessed, he continued, was behavior not just unprofessional, but disgraceful. His words sliced the air. Daniel's face turned crimson. Respect, Richard said, stepping closer to the edge of the podium, is not optional. It is the foundation of this badge. Without it, we fail. Not just each other, but the people we swore to protect. He paused, eyes fixed on Daniel's. This morning, one of you spit in my face, and the rest of you laughed. No one breathed. No one moved. That moment, Richard declared, was not just about me. It was about a culture that celebrates cruelty, that feeds on prejudice. And it ends today. Daniels shifted, sweat dripping down his brow. Richard's gaze burned through him. You didn't care who I was, he said, voice sharp, because you assumed I didn't matter. That's exactly the problem. But Richard wasn't finished. He was about to drop a bombshell, one that would send shockwaves through the entire room. The silence in the room weighed heavy, every officer glued to the podium where Richard stood unwavering. Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his arrogance stripped bare in the glare of truth. Richard let the moment breathe, the weight of his words pressing down on every uniform in that room. Effective immediately, Richard announced, his voice slicing through the stillness. Officer Daniels is suspended pending a full internal investigation. Gasps rippled across the briefing room. Coffee cups froze midair. Whispers swirled like a storm. Daniel's face contorted in shock. His eyes darted around, seeking support among the same officers who had been laughing with him moments earlier. But now their gazes slipped to the floor. No one came to his defense. The humiliation was absolute. This is not about punishment, Richard continued, pacing slowly across the front of the room. This is about accountability. If you think this department is a place where disrespect thrives unchecked, you are wrong. Those days are over. Daniel stammered, his voice cracking. Chief, I didn't know. Richard cut him off. That's exactly the problem, officer. You didn't care to know. You didn't care to think. And that lack of care? That is poison in a uniform. The words landed like blows, not just on Daniels, but on every officer in the room. Some shifted in their seats, their faces betraying guilt, shame, unease. Richard could see it, the recognition that this moment wasn't only about one man's mistake, but about the mirror being held up to all of them. He stepped back to the podium and scanned the crowd. Change is not comfortable. It never is. But let me be clear. This department will not be a breeding ground for contempt, cruelty, or arrogance. If you cannot uphold dignity, if you cannot respect the humanity of every single person who walks through these doors, then this is not the place for you. Daniel's face turned beet red, his jaw clenched, his fists balled at his side. But beneath his anger was fear, the unmistakable fear of a man whose power had just been shattered in front of everyone. Richard let his final words hang heavy. The community deserves better, and from this moment forward, they will get it. But the fallout was only beginning, because behind closed doors, Richard was about to uncover just how deep Daniel's misconduct went, and the discovery would shake the precinct to its core. Later that day, Richard sat in his new office for the first time. The blinds were half closed, stripes of sunlight cutting across his desk where a stack of files waited. Captain Harris entered, his expression cautious. He placed a thick folder down. This is Daniel's record, Harris said. Everything, complaints, incidents, you name it. Richard flipped it open. Page after page told the same story. Use of excessive force, civilian complaints dismissed without follow-up, whispered accusations of harassment swept under the rug. The deeper he went, the heavier his chest felt. This wasn't just one bad morning. This was a pattern that had been tolerated. His hand tightened around the folder. "How many of these were investigated properly?" Richard asked quietly. Harris hesitated. "Not enough." Richard leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. The truth was laid bare. Daniels wasn't just a bully. He was a symptom of a culture that had been allowed to fester for years. And now Richard had the power and the burden of tearing it out by the roots. Camera pans to Richard staring at the files, the weight of his mission pressing down. And this is where the story demands your voice too. If you believe in standing up against corruption, in demanding accountability, in fighting for dignity, then this is the place to be. Hit that subscribe button right now, because together, we will keep uncovering stories that matter, stories that demand to be heard. Don't just watch. Be part of the change. Back to Richard flipping the last page, eyes burning with resolve. Because what Richard was about to do next wouldn't just rattle Daniels. It would send shockwaves through every officer who thought they could hide behind silence. The next morning, whispers ran through the precinct like wildfire. Daniels, humiliated and suspended, had filed an appeal. His allies, few but loud, murmured about unfair treatment. Some officers muttered in corners about the new chief throwing his weight around. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Richard walked the halls deliberately, stopping to greet every officer he passed. His presence was both reminder and warning. The days of invisible leadership were gone, but resistance brewed. A group of senior officers lingered in the locker room, grumbling under their breath. "Man comes in here one day and thinks he knows everything." Another scoffed. "Suspend Daniels and what? Expect us all to bow down? He won't last 6 months." The bitterness was thick, but Richard anticipated it. Change always drew battle lines. He called a meeting not to lecture but to listen. Around the long oak table, he invited voices, especially the quiet ones. To his surprise, a young officer named Reyes spoke up. Her voice trembled, but her words were brave. "I laughed yesterday," she admitted. "Not because I thought it was funny, because I was scared. That's the truth. I didn't want to be Daniel's next target." The room fell silent. Richard leaned forward, his eyes steady on hers. "It starts with honesty," he said gently. "You don't need to be perfect. You just need to be better than yesterday. That's how we change this." Some nodded, shame softening their expressions. Others crossed their arms, resistant. But a crack had opened in the wall of silence. Richard knew it was only the beginning, but it was enough. Yet even as small sparks of change began to glow, Daniels wasn't done fighting. And what he tried next would test Richard's leadership like never before. Daniels stormed back into the precinct weeks later, defiant. Though still suspended, he wore his uniform like armor, strutting through the halls as though he owned them. Officers exchanged wary glances. Some whispered, others looked away. He confronted Richard in the corridor. "You can't erase me, Chief," he spat. "I've been here longer than you. These people know me. You'll never change this place." Richard stood tall, calm as a mountain. "You're right," he said evenly. "I can't change this place alone. But I don't need to, because every day more of them are choosing change themselves. And that's something you'll never understand." Daniel sneered, but his eyes flickered with doubt. For the first time, his grip on the precinct was slipping. That same week, the internal review concluded. Daniel's appeal was denied. The thick file of complaints became his undoing. Richard made the announcement publicly. No more whispered decisions in dark offices. Transparency became the new law of the land. The officers listened. Some grim, some relieved. But the message was clear. The old ways were dead. And yet, Richard knew true victory wouldn't come from punishing the guilty, but from rebuilding trust with the community outside those walls. And for that, he would need something more powerful than authority. He would need hope. One bright Saturday, Richard attended a community event at the local park. Children played under the sun. Families gathered around food stalls. Music floated on the breeze. But the mood shifted when Richard, in uniform, walked among them. Conversations hushed. Eyes lingered with caution. Years of mistrust didn't vanish overnight. As he greeted people warmly, a boy no older than 10 approached. His small hands balled into fists at his sides. He looked up, hesitant but determined. "Are you really the chief?" he asked. Richard crouched to his level. "I am." The boy's voice dropped to a whisper. "My dad says the police don't care about us." The words struck deep, heavier than any insult or spit. Richard met the boy's gaze, steady and kind. "I can't change the past," he said gently. "But I promise we are working to do better. And if you ever need help, you come find me. Okay?" The boy's lips trembled before a small smile broke through. He nodded. And in that fleeting moment, hope flickered. Not just in the boy's eyes, but in the community watching from the sidelines. Whispers softened. Conversations resumed. A wall had begun to crack. But even with small victories, Richard knew one truth. Change inside the precinct had to keep pace with the hope outside. And that final test was waiting just around the corner. Months passed. Slowly, the precinct changed. Daniel's allies shrank into silence, their influence fading. Recruits entered with fresh eyes and open hearts. Training sessions on bias, respect, and accountability became the norm, not the exception. And though skepticism remained, something undeniable was happening. The culture was shifting. One evening, Richard walked the halls as officers clocked out. He listened. The laughter he heard was different now. Lighter, shared, without cruelty. Jokes no longer came at someone's expense. Camaraderie was genuine. He paused by the glass doors, watching his officers step into the night, blending into the community they served. For the first time, Richard allowed himself a smile. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was better. And better was worth every fight. But here's the truth. This story isn't just about Richard. It's about every choice we make, every silence we break, every stand we take. Because real change always starts with one person brave enough to demand it. The story of Richard Nelson, the chief who walked into his precinct undercover and was spat on by one of his own, isn't just about humiliation. It's about transformation, about the courage to stand firm when the easy road is silence, about the power of dignity in the face of cruelty. As the months turned to a year, Blue Ridge wasn't the same precinct it had been. The corruption wasn't gone, but it was no longer hidden. The culture wasn't perfect, but it was no longer poisoned. And the community, once wary, once hardened, began to see the smallest signs of trust returning. Richard stood one evening in his office, looking out across the city he had sworn to protect. The lights of Blue Ridge twinkled like stars against the dark hills. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe change was possible. Not easy, not quick, but possible. And that belief, that hope, was more powerful than any badge. Because in the end, leadership isn't about power. It's about the courage to stand alone until others are brave enough to stand with you.